Is it possible that nuclear weapons will be used again? For answers, we turn to Michaela Dodge, a specialist at the Heritage Foundation. She'll discuss them next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. During the Cold War, the threat of nuclear weapons was constant. Today, in many respects, it still is. Michaela Dodge, a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, understands what has changed and what hasn't. Welcome to the show, Michaela.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
Take us back in time a little bit to help our viewers understand what the nuclear threat was during the Cold War.
So during the Cold War, we focused on the threat of an attack by the Soviet Union. We worried little less about China. We did not worry about France or the United Kingdom, which were the only other declared nuclear powers. With respect to the Soviet Union, we were worried about accidental launches, and we were also worried about massive Soviet out-of-the-blue attack. And that threat decreased since the end of the Cold War, fortunately.
Now, you come from a part of the world where this whole issue of the potential use of nuclear weapons was taken very seriously because you were right there. Tell us about that experience, where you grew up and how you saw things growing up.
So I grew up in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia. And there is a strange schizophreny on the part of my family because the Soviets instituted conscription army, and so my dad was on the wrong side of the barricade, you would say, manning air defense systems when he was a recruit. Now, my father-in-law was on the opposite side, listening to what the Czechs were saying over the radio and trying to ascertain whether they were planning a nuclear attack and whether the attack has started. So it's very strange to think about that legacy and think about how much has changed since then. And many things changed for good. And that's why it's so worrisome what we see in Russia recently.
Take us back to the period of the Cold War. What was the nuclear threat then?
During the Cold War, we worried about out-of-the-blue attack by the Soviet forces, by the Soviet nuclear forces, and we devised this theory which was called mutually assured destruction. And the theory said that if we give the Soviets free ride to our cities and can respond back, they would not attack in the first place. We since have moved past that theory, in part because threats today are different than they were during the Cold War, and because the Soviet threat of an out-of-the-blue nuclear attack somewhat receded. But partly it is why it's so worrisome what the Russians are doing today and how they're moving their nuclear strategy towards emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons.
There were some people during the Cold War who didn't believe the Soviets would use their nuclear weapons. What is your view on that?
You know, I think that we lucked out of the Cold War. We were incredibly lucky that none of the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons on both the US side and the Russian side was not used since the end of the Second World War. But I would not attribute it to kind of automatic, they would never use it because they're not irrational that way. We worked very hard on trying to figure out ways how to make deterrence work, how to communicate with the Soviets, how to make sure that they understand our intentions, how to make sure that we understand their intentions. And a lot of that thinking was lost since the end of the Cold War, because suddenly the people were very optimistic that threats were going to disappear, and they were very optimistic that we will not have to worry about nuclear attacks anymore. And of course, 20 years later, we know that we were wrong and that we need to reconstitute our ability to think about nuclear war, although in a new context.
Mm-hmm. What was the standing policy of the Soviets regarding the use of nuclear weapons? Was it something they had said they were prepared to use in a preemptive fashion if necessary?
During the Cold War, the Soviets were planning on using hundreds and thousands of nuclear weapons in the initial attack, and then wait a little bit and see if somebody survived, and if so, they would continue with biological and chemical weapons attacks. And after that, they would send their conventional forces. We thought about the nuclear war or outbreak of nuclear war, especially in Western Europe, differently. We thought that there would be a limited nuclear exchange. You would respond in kind to signal your seriousness, and you would try to de-escalate the conflict. But the Soviets were not thinking like that. They would just go all out initially with the intent of defeating and winning a nuclear war, however bizarre it may sound to us.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have more than a passing interest in all of this because you grew up in a country that was part of the buffer zone between the Soviets and Western Europe. Tell us about that experience.
You know, it's very interesting because today I'm an American, and my father-in-law back in the Cold War was trained to speak Czech, and he was sitting on the border in Germany listening to exchanges between Czechoslovak and Warsaw Pact countries and trying to ascertain from their talk whether an attack or a nuclear attack was coming. Well, around the same time, we found out my dad was in the Soviet army as a conscript, manning air defense systems and being just part of those forces that would absorb brunt of the NATO attack, should NATO attack first, which was not the plan, or supporting the potential Soviet advances. So in a way, it's just fascinating. I'm very glad that we are not in that situation anymore. I'm very glad that Eastern Europeans, for the most part today, are free and they're integrated into Western political and military structures. It cost a lot of work in terms of diplomacy, in terms of pursuing democratic reforms, in terms of setting sort of new standards, new value standards for your society. And it's been a long way, and there is still a long way ahead. But I'm very grateful that I get to work now on the US side, giving back to America in a way.
Now, you grew up during the dawn of a new era in the former Soviet Union, the Gorbachev period. Were people trusting that this was sincere, that this really was going to amount to significant change, freedom, openness, etc.?
I think so, and I remember people being incredibly excited. You know, after it turned out that the Soviets will not be militarily interfering with democratic developments in Eastern Europe, people went to the streets. They demanded freedom. They demanded change of the regime. They did not want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. And, you know, I was a kid back then, and I remember my parents were clinging the keys, and they were like, we have to go to the square to cling the keys to, you know, ring for freedom. And I didn't know any better. I was a kid, and I thought, why would you do that? You know, you're clinging the keys, that's just stupid. It's not going to do anything. But it was just the mood in the society. It was very exciting. It was a new era. It was democracy. It was this just incredible goodness bestowed upon Eastern Europeans.
And then a short time later, in 1991, this superpower that had been such a threat for so many decades disintegrates. And you have Russia and the other successor states. Eastern Europe is free. And Russia seems to recede significantly from the world stage because it's in a period of weakness, suffering from severe economic problems and so forth. Did people begin to breathe even more easily after that, thinking that the Russian threat was gone?
You know, I think so. I think there was a lot of optimism and a lot of desire for Russia to normalize, for Russia to become just like another Czech Republic or another Slovakia, another normal state with which would democratize and which with you could conduct normal business and which would not be a threat to its neighbor. Now, of course, you cannot erase 40 years of history, and so keen observers were somewhat skeptical from early on that Russia will be able to fully democratize, because the challenges that the Russians face in terms of pursuing democracy were much bigger than Eastern Europeans, because Eastern Europeans are smaller countries. They did not, for the most part, they did not choose to be part of the regime for 40 plus years. They were on the borders, so they were economically better off than Russia or countries that were closer to Russia and that were part of the Soviet Union. But there was huge optimism, and then Vladimir Putin came to power, and we still thought initially that there is opportunity for cooperation. But we've since learned that we were wrong, and what Vladimir Putin desires is to go back to superpower status, go back to having influence in what Russia calls its near abroad, which in a sense includes former Soviet Union territories. And those are dangerous developments.
And so what we saw several years ago in Georgia and more recently in Ukraine are, in your opinion, indications of what's to come?
That is a very difficult question. I think there is no answer as of now, because in a way we are creating answer to that question right now. The answer will depend on NATO's willingness to respond to aggressions in Ukraine and in Georgia. It will depend on U.S. leadership on the continent, on U.S. assurances to allies, how much allies trust that the U.S. will come to their defense, how much are the Europeans willing to defend themselves. So that's the important piece of the puzzle. We are creating our response right now. We are in a position where we can influence Putin's calculus. And that will determine whether he will keep moving or whether he will stop.
You referenced NATO. Let's go back to why the North Atlantic Treaty was established and the conditions under which it might be invoked.
So NATO initially was established after the end of the Second World War, and the original purpose was to keep Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And of course, since then, the purpose of NATO has changed, and NATO expanded, incorporated many new members, some of them parts of the former Soviet Union. And Alliance has been struggling in a way to find its new purpose. So in the 90s, it was out of area or out of business. And today we're going back to the roots of the Alliance as a collective security organization. And we're trying to figure out what it means when we have new members and when we have increased potential for conflict with Russia. What it means, how do we assure these new members? What can Alliance do, where its role is? But I do think it's very important to keep in mind it's a collective security organization, and if Article 5 is invoked, members of other countries have to help whoever is attacked, because that is the most important purpose of the Alliance.
Is that an automatic response, or is something that has to be discussed?
It is something that has to be discussed. So the Atlantic Council has to approve that there will be a vote on whether Article 5 is invoked. And during those periods of discussions about whether there will be a vote, any NATO member can block the discussion. And so you may not get to the point where you have a vote on whether Article 5 is invoked.
Let's look at a few scenarios. involving a Russian attack and explain to our viewers how the responses would vary. The first, a more extensive attack against a country that is not part of NATO, such as Ukraine. Second, an attack against one of the newer members that at one time were part of the Soviet sphere of influence. And then lastly, an attack against one of the Western European NATO partners.
So we see with Ukraine how NATO organizes itself to respond. And one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of disunity between allies, between different members of NATO, as to what to do about Ukraine. The alliance cannot agree on whether it should provide military help, significant military help to the Ukrainians. It has difficult time imposing meaningful sanctions on Russia. It has difficult time even admitting initially that Russia invaded Ukraine. So we see a lot of problems and many political divisions, whether in the context of NATO members themselves. Now, in the case that Eastern European state would be attacked by Russia, I think the alliance would respond. It would have to respond because the credibility of the entire alliance and credibility of U.S. allied structure would be at stake. And that would be incredibly problematic for our other relations, for example, with South Korea or with Japan. And Asian countries are observers of how we conduct our alliances in Europe. And in many ways, they aspire to have those kinds of close military relationships with the United States. Now, in the case of an attack on Western Europe, I think it would be similar discussion as you would see with respect to an attack on Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. I don't think there would be that much of a difference in terms of how the process would be handled. I think it would be more serious, but an attack on an Eastern European country is serious too. It's not less serious just because there are new members.
Yeah, I was wondering, what is the aftermath of a tactical nuclear weapon like? We have these images of Japan in World War II, but is it an environment that would be safe for conventional troops to come in afterward?
It would depend on whether the troops are trained to operate in radiation environment. It would depend on whether their tanks and their military equipment is hardened from effects of nuclear weapons. And that just depends. It depends on trainings, it depends on skills. We do know that the Russians fairly routinely conduct big military exercises during which they use nuclear weapons. They use scenarios in which nuclear weapons are used. But in terms of actually using nuclear weapons, I think we would deal with a big attack. There would be interplay between conventional forces attacking and nuclear forces attacking, and we would pretty much deal with an all-out war on the European theater. Because if you are really using a nuclear weapon, you really are signaling that this is worthwhile for you, and it's fundamentally different from conflicts that we have had since the end of the Second World War.
What do the Russians' military moves in and around Ukraine tell us about their likely intentions? And I'm thinking in the aftermath of the conflict in Georgia, it was clear that the Russian conventional capabilities were not what everyone thought they were, mm-hmm. and that, I think, sparked a lot of this re-examination of capabilities. But they've gotten much better since then, and we're seeing their better, if not their best, troops in Ukraine. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the stability of other parts of Russia where those top troops had been posted before?
So what we have seen with Russia is, initially denying that they're even sending anyone to Ukraine, which now they've publicly admitted that it was indeed Russian soldiers. We saw Russia sending their not as proficient military forces, which is why the Ukrainians initially made advances and were able to defend. That changed as Russia sent their better performing forces and eventually their best performing troops. Some of them, they withdrew from regions like Chechnya. And so today the suspicion or maybe the worry is that if you have your best forces tied down in Ukraine, what gives? Where will be other conflicts in Russia that those forces were able to keep under control? And I think that remains to be seen in the next couple of years.
What do you make of the recent moves that NATO has made to reinforce its capabilities, especially in the newer members, and have they been reassured by these moves?
I think new members have been reassured by these moves. I do think that the conflict in Ukraine has shown that defense spending is incredibly important. And for a very long time, Europeans, they're not willing to spend their share on defense because of welfare state, because of other factors. But conflict in Ukraine really shows us the lack of capabilities, the dangers of a lack of capabilities. And I would hope so that ministries of defense are seriously reassessing their investments so far. The situation from funding perspective has been better in Eastern European states, which committed to increasing funding for defense, especially in Poland. But still, the Poles or the Eastern Europeans cannot defend Russian conventional army. They just don't have enough capability, which is why they have been relying on NATO and which is why they've been relying on US leadership. And that's what makes the US leadership and NATO critical. It's the key part of deterrence. It's the key part signaling to Russia that we will defend our allies is perhaps the best thing we can do in terms of dissuading Putin from thinking about attacking the Balts or moving forward on NATO members.
How secure is Putin himself? Every time he disappears from visibility for a while, they start speculating that he may have been deposed, something else could be up, and then he pops up and things resume. Do you think he's solidly in place for the foreseeable future? I know it's impossible to predict the future, but just informed speculation.
Informed speculation would be that yes, he is in power. However, we would like to question it. And sometimes totalitarian regimes appear very strong on the surface, but they're very fragile inside. And in a way, we've seen that with the Cold War, where very few anticipated the end of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But I do think he is firmly in control. He has important constituencies on his side. Now, the question is, as the cost of the conflict in Ukraine increase, both economically, militarily, and internationally, will that support be more fragile? Will there be more pressure on kind of Russia to normalize its relations with the rest of the world? But the history teaches us that the Russians can go for a very long time without benefits of normalization.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Michaela Dodge.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.